here we go.
Good.
Okay, go ahead. Here goes mommy. Shh, shh.
All right. The dangers of mandatory overtime. Did you know that critical care nurses working 12 and a half consecutive hours or longer had nearly doubled the risk of making a medication error? A lot of these medication errors are fatal to patients. Now take a second and imagine your job was able to dictate how many extra hours you needed to work a week based on their staffing needs. I have done a lot of educational research on mandatory overtime, and I have first-hand experience in the distress caused from it.
No.
Imagine you have a 12-hour shift. That 12 hours turns into 13 hours. Your patient's coding 14 hours, 15 hours, in addition to going to school full-time, being a mother full-time, and trying to have a home life as well. Hospitals are using mandatory overtime as a staffing tool to bridge nurse shortages. Mandatory overtime does not only put patients' lives at risk by increasing the errors that a nurse could make, but causes moral distress to staff nurses attempting to accommodate the needs for their profession. Go ahead and change it. Go ahead. So what is mandatory overtime? Mandatory overtime are additional hours required by your employer that exceeds a standard 40-hour work week. It's used in nursing to help ease staffing shortages. 18 states already have enacted laws and regulations that prohibit or limit mandatory overtime for nurses. The Federal Fair Labor Standards Act requires employees to pay 1.5 times the regular hourly pay to employees that exceed a 40-hour work week. The mandatory overtime laws for hospital workers, so these show the different states of who has enacted restrictions and who has not. Mandatory overtime that is required of nurses puts the patient's lives at risk. Critical care nurses working 12 and a half hours or longer have a double risk of making a medication error or mistake. Hospitals would save approximately $98 million related to complications or additional necessary care due to preventable medical errors, including medication errors caused by mandatory overtime. Mandatory overtime is dangerous to patient and increase hospitals' costs. The most obvious advantage of mandatory overtime for employees is the extra money. Employees are required to pay time and a half for overtime hours. Go back, please. Another advantage for mandatory overtime is, I don't really have any. The money is basically it. It's supposed to be used as a short-term resolution for staffing shortages. However, this has become the norm. In addition to putting patients' lives at risk, mandatory overtime increases nurse burnout and distress. Requiring nurses to work extra long hours leads to imbalance in work and home life. This leads to increased nurse turnaround and nurse shortages, which is why they're using the mandatory overtime in the first place. Many nurses are not only working extra hours, but they're working with an increased patient load and acuity. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reported critical staffing shortages in 24% of the U.S. hospitals during COVID-19. These nurses were required to work mandatory overtime while still being ill with COVID-19. Mandatory overtime is detrimental to physical and mental health. Positive mental and physical health is vital for those attempting to care for others. Mandatory overtime, as I've stated before, increased risk for mistakes. This could be a mistake that costs somebody their life. Increased nurse burnout, morale in the workplace decreases, and the physical health and mental well-being of the nurse is put at risk. Burnout can also lead to a condition known as compassion fatigue, where nurses experience the inability to empathize with their patients. Now, this is extremely detrimental because that's what nurses are expected to do. They're expected to care for their patients, be empathetic to them, and if you're experiencing burnout, you're unable to do those things. Can you go to the next slide, please? 42% of nurses reported being forced to work overtime at least once a month. Can you go to the next slide, please? This causes the high nurse turnaround and $2,000 more for the hospital per discharge. Based on the 20% turnover rate, a hospital with 600 nurses will spend $6.9 million a year in replacement costs to train new nurses. Can you go next, please? The U.S. Department of Health, I already said that. So now let's take a look at a possible solution to this issue. Instead of mandating nurses to work excessive hours, voluntary overtime could be offered with better pay. Additionally, enacting legislation to prohibit mandatory overtime in all the United States is vital. Travel nurses can be used to bridge gaps in patient care. Now let's visualize nursing without mandatory overtime. It would allow the patients to get the safe, effective care they deserve while in the hospital. Fatal medication errors will decrease and staff morale will increase. Nurses will be happier to be at work because they're actually choosing to be there. Nurses will feel in more control and confident in their choices in the workplace, and patient care would benefit. Isn't that what everyone deserves when they come to the hospital? You can go to the next slide, please. These are some nursing unions that give nurses the chance to advocate for safe working conditions and nurse-to-patient ratios. National Nurses United is the largest union for the RNs in the United States. Now, I need you to act. I encourage you to act. Forced work should not be allowed in any workplace, especially when caring for others. Increased mistakes and burnout lead to increasing nurse shortages and lack of compassion. Sick individuals need compassionate nurses at the bedside to assist with their care. At the height of COVID-19, pandemic nurses worked around the clock, putting themselves and their families at risk to care for their patients. Isn't it time to look out for them too?